The night sky above Tehran turned orange. Across three of Iran's most strategically critical cities simultaneously, the ground shook with a violence that residents had never experienced before. Tehran, Shiraz, and Tabriz were struck in a coordinated wave of Israeli airstrikes that targeted regime infrastructure with a precision and a scale that has left military analysts around the world struggling to fully comprehend what they are witnessing. Massive explosions tore through the northern districts of the Iranian capital, through the historic neighborhoods of Jamaran and Sadatabad, through the arteries of Damavan Street and Martyrs Square, through Narmak and along the Bagheri Highway. Citizens flooded social media with footage of fire columns rising into the sky, of windows shattering across entire city blocks, of the unmistakable sound of a military campaign that is no longer a threat, but a reality unfolding in real time. The Israeli Air Force did not issue a vague statement. It announced an extensive wave of strikes aimed directly at Iranian regime infrastructure, using language that leaves no room for diplomatic ambiguity. This was not a warning shot. This was not a calculated signal designed to open a negotiation. According to multiple reports emerging from the region, this represents one of the most expansive single-night Israeli military operations ever conducted against Iranian territory, and what happens in the days that follow may reshape the entire strategic architecture of the Middle East for a generation. But here is the question that every intelligence agency, every government, and every analyst is now asking behind closed doors. What exactly did Israel know before it launched this wave, and more importantly, what comes next? Because the decision to strike Tehran, Shiraz, and Tabriz simultaneously, all in a single coordinated operation, is not a decision that any military makes impulsively. It is a decision that reflects weeks, possibly months, of preparation, of intelligence gathering, of strategic deliberation at the highest levels of government. And that suggests that Israel's leadership has reached a conclusion that the international community needs to understand clearly. This is not a response. This is an escalation with an objective. To understand why this moment carries such extraordinary weight, it is essential to trace the trajectory of Israeli-Iranian tensions over the past several years, and to understand precisely why the calculus shifted so dramatically that Jerusalem chose this particular moment to act with such overwhelming force. For years, Israeli military and intelligence doctrine operated on what analysts called the campaign between wars, a sustained effort to degrade Iranian military capabilities primarily through covert operations, targeted strikes against weapons convoys in Syria, assassinations of nuclear scientists, and cyber attacks on critical Iranian infrastructure. The goal was containment, not confrontation. The goal was to slow Iran's nuclear program, degrade Hezbollah's precision missile arsenal, and prevent the establishment of a permanent Iranian military presence on Israel's northern border, all without triggering a full-scale war that could spiral beyond anyone's control. That doctrine, which served Israel reasonably well for over a decade, has now been fundamentally abandoned. And the abandonment did not happen overnight. It happened through a series of escalations that gradually convinced the Israeli security establishment that the containment strategy had reached its limits, that Iran's nuclear timeline had compressed to a point where waiting was no longer a viable option, and that the proxy network Tehran spent decades building had grown so capable that a future conflict on those terms would be unacceptably costly. Some analysts believe the October 2023 attack, the scale of the missile and drone salvos Iran launched directly at Israel in the months that followed, and the growing intelligence about Iranian nuclear progress collectively convinced Israeli decision-makers that the strategic environment had fundamentally changed. The question was never whether Israel would act more decisively. The question was when, and at what scale. The answer arrived over Tehran, Shiraz, and Tabriz in the form of what the Israeli Air Force described as an extensive, simultaneous, multi-city operation targeting regime infrastructure. The word extensive carries enormous significance in the context of how Israel communicates its military operations. It signals not only the scale of what has already occurred, but the potential scope of what may follow. And the choice of targets across 3 cities, separated by hundreds of kilometers, is a deliberate demonstration that Israeli military reach inside Iran is not limited to border regions or to individual facilities. It extends to the heart of the country, to the industrial city of Tabriz in the northwest, to the ancient city of Shiraz in the south, and to the capital itself. There are growing concerns that this operation represents the opening phase of a sustained campaign rather than a standalone strike, and the evidence for that assessment is significant. Military campaigns of this complexity, this geographic breadth, this level of coordination between multiple strike packages operating across separate airspace corridors simultaneously are not designed to achieve a single objective and then conclude. They are designed to suppress air defenses, to degrade command and control, to create conditions for follow-on operations. If Israel's stated goal is the elimination or severe degradation of Iran's ability to threaten Israeli territory directly, either through ballistic missiles, through its nuclear program, or through the activation of regional proxy forces, then what occurred on this night is almost certainly not the end of anything. It is the beginning. What makes this moment particularly dangerous and particularly consequential for the entire region is the position it places the Islamic Republic in. Iran's leadership faces a dilemma that has no good solutions available to it, and understanding the nature of that dilemma is essential to understanding what the next 48 to 72 hours may bring. On one hand, the Islamic Republic cannot absorb strikes of this magnitude without a visible and forceful response, without severely damaging its own credibility, both domestically and across the network of proxy forces, militias, and regional allies it has spent decades cultivating and financing. The entire architecture of Iranian regional influence is built on the perception of Tehran as a resolute, capable, and willing patron. If that perception collapses because Iran absorbed a devastating Israeli strike campaign without meaningful retaliation, the consequences for Iranian strategic influence could be profound and lasting. On the other hand, Iran's options for retaliation carry their own catastrophic risks. A direct missile salvo against Israeli population centers or military infrastructure risks triggering additional Israeli strikes that could target what remains of Iran's nuclear program, its air defense systems, its oil export infrastructure, or potentially its leadership itself. There is growing speculation among regional analysts that Israel's strikes may have been deliberately sequenced to degrade Iranian air defense capabilities first, precisely to reduce the cost of follow-on operations if Iran chooses to escalate further, and if Iran activates Hezbollah, which still retains an estimated 100,000 rockets and missiles despite the attrition it suffered in recent conflicts, the possibility of a multi-front war that drags in additional regional actors becomes significantly more real. The international response to this operation will also carry enormous consequences for how the crisis develops. The United States government has been publicly supportive of Israel's right to self-defense, while simultaneously expressing concern about escalation dynamics in the region. Some analysts believe that Washington had advanced knowledge of at least the general parameters of Israel's intended operation, though no official confirmation of that has been forthcoming. What is clear is that American naval assets remain deployed in the region, that American air defense systems continue to operate in coordination with Israeli forces, and that the diplomatic signals coming out of Washington since the strikes began have been notably measured rather than alarmed, which itself tells a story about the degree of coordination that exists between the two governments at this moment. The strikes on Shiraz carry particular strategic significance that deserves specific attention. Shiraz is not merely a historic city and cultural landmark. It is home to significant Iranian military and aerospace infrastructure, including facilities that some intelligence assessments have linked to components of Iran's long-range missile production program. Targeting Shiraz simultaneously with Tehran and Tabriz suggests that Israel was not simply striking symbolic targets or attempting to send a political message. It suggests that Israel was targeting specific capabilities, specific facilities, specific elements of Iranian military power that its intelligence assessed as the most urgent threats. The precision implied by a simultaneous multi-city operation of this scale points toward an intelligence picture of exceptional detail and raises the question of how Israel obtained such specific operational information about the locations and vulnerabilities of its targets. Tabriz, meanwhile, represents a different dimension of strategic significance. Located in Iran's northwestern Azerbaijan province, Tabriz sits in a region with its own complex ethnic and political dynamics. Some analysts have noted over the years that Iranian Azerbaijan's population, which shares cultural and linguistic ties with the Republic of Azerbaijan, represents a potential pressure point in any sustained conflict scenario. The decision to include Tabriz as a target in this wave of strikes may reflect Israeli military calculations about degrading Iranian capabilities in the northwest specifically, or it may carry signals about the geographic scope of the campaign that Israeli planners intend to pursue. It raises an important question about whether the strikes were chosen purely for their military value or whether they were also selected to communicate something about the breadth of Israeli capability and intent to Iranian planners. It is worth examining what this operation reveals about the evolution of Israeli Air Force capabilities over the past decade, because the technical dimensions of what occurred matter enormously for understanding the strategic picture going forward. Conducting simultaneous strikes across 3 geographically separated cities inside Iranian territory requires not only the aircraft and munitions to execute the strikes themselves, but an extensive support architecture, including aerial refueling assets, electronic warfare aircraft to suppress Iranian radar and communications, real-time intelligence feeds to adjust targeting as the operation unfolds, and coordination mechanisms capable of synchronizing multiple strike packages across different corridors simultaneously. The fact that Israel appears to have executed this successfully, and to have done so with the element of surprise intact until the strikes were already underway, represents a significant demonstration of military capability that the Iranian military establishment will now need to assess very carefully. There are now essentially 3 scenarios that analysts consider most plausible as the situation develops, and each carries fundamentally different implications for the region and for the world. The first scenario is controlled escalation followed by negotiated de-escalation. In this scenario, Iran calculates that the cost of further escalation exceeds the cost of absorbing the strikes and pursuing diplomatic avenues to restore some form of deterrence equilibrium. Some analysts argue that economic pressure, the degraded state of Iranian air defenses after these strikes, and the internal political pressures the Iranian government faces from a population that has endured years of sanctions and economic hardship could create space for a back-channel process aimed at de-escalation. This scenario assumes that Iranian leadership is ultimately rational in the strategic sense, that it is capable of making calculated decisions under pressure, and that it sees more long-term value in surviving politically than in escalating into a conflict whose outcome it cannot control. The success of this scenario would depend heavily on whether mediating parties, and there are always mediating parties in Middle Eastern conflicts, can create a face-saving exit path for Tehran that allows it to claim some form of resistance narrative without requiring actions that would trigger further Israeli military responses. The second scenario is limited Iranian retaliation, followed by stabilization. In this scenario, Iran calculates that it must respond visibly, but calibrates the response carefully to avoid triggering the most devastating potential Israeli follow-on strikes. This might involve missile strikes on Israeli military targets, or more likely activation of proxy forces in ways that are deniable enough to allow both sides to avoid direct escalation while still permitting Iran to claim it did not absorb the Israeli strikes passively. This scenario is historically consistent with how the Islamic Republic has managed escalation dynamics in the past, using calculated force in ways designed to restore deterrence without crossing thresholds that would provoke a response it cannot absorb. The risk of this scenario is that miscalculation is always possible, that proxy activation creates dynamics that are difficult to control once set in motion, and that Israel's current government has demonstrated a willingness to respond to Iranian-linked attacks with a decisiveness that makes the historical pattern of managed escalation less reliable as a guide to future behavior. The third scenario is full-scale escalation with regional consequences. This is the scenario that regional governments and international institutions are most urgently working to prevent, precisely because its consequences are almost impossible to contain once it begins. If Iran responds to Israel's strikes with large-scale ballistic missile attacks, if Israel responds to those attacks with strikes targeting Iranian nuclear facilities or leadership infrastructure, if Hezbollah activates its full arsenal, if other regional actors are drawn in, either by choice or by circumstance, the result could be a regional war of a scale and duration that the Middle East has not seen in decades. The economic consequences alone, the impact on global oil markets, on shipping through the Persian Gulf, on the stability of governments across the region that are already under significant pressure, would be severe. And the human cost, borne primarily by civilians who have no voice in these decisions, would be catastrophic. What happens next may reshape the entire region for decades. But there is a dimension of this crisis that deserves attention that it rarely receives in the immediate aftermath of military operations, which is the perspective of the populations caught inside these geopolitical calculations, the citizens of Tehran who were awakened by explosions they did not choose, the people of Shiraz and Tabriz who found themselves suddenly at the center of a conflict whose origins stretch back decades, the Israelis who have lived for years under the shadow of the threat that Iran represents, and who now face the uncertainty of what comes next. These are not abstractions. They are human beings whose lives are being shaped by decisions made in rooms they will never enter, by leaders they cannot hold accountable in any meaningful time frame, by the terrible logic of strategic deterrence and military capability that has always cost most heavily those who have the least power over it. The strikes on Tehran, Shiraz, and Tabriz are already being described in Israeli military circles as a significant operational success. But military success and strategic success are different things, and history is full of examples where the former produced the conditions that made the latter impossible. The question that will define what this moment means, looking back from some future vantage point, is not whether Israel successfully executed a complex military operation. The evidence strongly suggests it did. The question is what the operation produces, what it changes in the underlying dynamics of Iranian behavior and capability, what it costs in terms of regional stability, and whether it ultimately makes the populations of the region safer or whether it accelerates the descent toward a conflict that nobody can fully control once it begins. Some analysts believe the strikes represent a strategic turning point, that they will force a reckoning within the Iranian system about the sustainability of the current confrontational posture, that they will degrade Iranian capabilities sufficiently to buy meaningful time on the nuclear question, and that they will restore a deterrence dynamic that had been eroding. Others argue that the strikes will harden Iranian resolve, accelerate nuclear decision-making in Tehran toward weaponization as the only perceived guarantee against further Israeli military action, and cement the view within Iran's leadership that negotiations are useless because the other side's ultimate goal is regime change rather than security. Both assessments are held by serious people with serious analytical frameworks, and the honest answer is that which of them proves correct depends on decisions that have not yet been made and responses that have not yet occurred. There is growing concern across European capitals and in Washington that the escalation dynamics now set in motion may prove very difficult to reverse without direct diplomatic intervention at the highest levels, and that the window for such intervention is narrowing rapidly as both sides come under domestic and strategic pressure to demonstrate resolve. The history of Middle Eastern conflicts teaches that military escalations that begin with limited objectives rarely end cleanly, that the fog of war creates its own momentum, and that the interests of external powers who might otherwise impose constraints become harder to align once blood has been shed and pride engaged on both sides. The night sky above Tehran turned orange, and with it, the strategic landscape of the Middle East shifted in ways that will take months and perhaps years to fully understand. The Israeli Air Force struck simultaneously across 3 cities, demonstrating a capability and a willingness to use it that redefines the parameters of this confrontation. Iran now faces its most consequential decision in a generation, a decision with no comfortable options, no clear exit path that preserves both its security and its deterrence credibility simultaneously. The international community watches with a mixture of alarm and uncertainty, acutely aware that the next move will determine whether this becomes a turning point toward some kind of new strategic equilibrium or the opening chapter of something far larger and far more destructive. The biggest question remains unanswered, not whether Israel can strike Iran, because tonight provided a definitive answer to that question. The biggest question is what Iran does next, and whether anyone with the influence to shape that decision is actively working to ensure that the answer does not plunge the entire region into the kind of conflict that leaves nothing unchanged and no one untouched. We are watching events unfold in real time that will be studied and debated by historians and strategists for decades. What those historians ultimately write will depend entirely on decisions being made right now, in the hours and days ahead, by people who understand the stakes better than anyone, and who nonetheless face a situation where every available path carries consequences that are difficult to fully predict and even more difficult to reverse once chosen. The world is watching, and the clock is moving.